Europe really thought it had this whole inflation thing beat, didn't they? Well, spoiler alert, they absolutely didn't. Instead, what we're watching unfold right now is a massive, accelerating, multi-front economic storm. Welcome to this explainer. Today we're unpacking a highly urgent analysis of Europe's current economic reality. So if you've been wondering why your grocery bills are literally refusing to drop, or why the industrial job market suddenly feels incredibly shaky, well, this is why. We're going to see exactly how a dangerous cocktail of higher energy prices, stubborn inflation, sky-high borrowing costs, weak growth, and fierce external competition aren't just happening at the same time, they're actively feeding off of each other. It's a literal chain reaction threatening a profoundly new economic crisis.
Okay, let's dive right into this. To make sense of how these overlapping crises interlock, here's our roadmap for today. We're looking at 1. The perfect economic storm. 2. The central bank's nightmare. 3. The new China shock. 4. The protectionism dilemma. And finally, 5. A crisis of competitiveness.
Starting off with Section 1, the perfect economic storm.
Now, to really grasp the gravity here, we've got to understand that these are absolutely not isolated problems. We're looking at a compounding chain reaction, where fixing one issue actively makes another one worse. It all kicks off at step 1, an energy shock. Because Europe's industrial machine relies so heavily on imported energy, those higher costs instantly trigger step 2, which is inflation. Then, naturally to fight that inflation, policymakers move to step 3, higher interest rates. But, as you know, expensive borrowing slams the brakes on the economy, leading right into step 4, industrial decline. And an industry in decline? Well, it is incredibly vulnerable to step 5, a surge in cheap Chinese imports. That then sparks European protectionism, escalating trade tensions, and boom, you have a perfect vicious cycle.
So what actually sparked that initial energy shock? Well, the source analysis makes a very specific and quite politically charged claim here. Quote, Europe gave up cost-effective Russian energy due to political reasons at its own detriment, end quote. The argument is that these geopolitical choices directly paved the way for the 2026 energy shocks, pushing oil and gas prices way up and creating massive anxiety around gas inventories. Now, regardless of where you stand on the politics, the source is really highlighting the profound economic trade-offs that come with these kinds of geopolitical maneuvers.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is exactly how fast those energy costs bled into the broader economy. Inflation in the euro area didn't just quietly fade away, it actually jumped to 2.9% in July of 2026, up from 2.8% the month before. And 2.9%, that is significantly blowing past the European Central Bank's target rate of just 2%. The source specifically notes that this jump was driven really sharply by that accelerating energy inflation we just talked about.
Which brings us to Section 2, the central bank's nightmare.
So, this renewed spike in energy inflation has essentially backed the European Central Bank into an impossible corner. The term for this trap, of course, is stagflation, a dangerous economic condition combining weaker economic growth with simultaneously higher inflation. Believe me, central bankers are absolutely losing sleep over this right now. I mean, normally, when an economy is weak, a central bank just cuts interest rates to stimulate borrowing and investment, right? But when growth is weak and inflation is rising at the exact same time, they are totally trapped. If the ECB cuts rates aggressively to help the economy, they just throw fuel on the inflation fire. But if they keep rates high to fight inflation, they crush an economy that is already super fragile.
So what has the ECB actually done? They've held their key deposit rate steady at 2.25%. And that expensive borrowing is just choking the real economy across the board. Just look at the business sector. Companies literally cannot afford the credit they need to build factories or hire people. For consumers, you and me, it means affordable credit for homes or major purchases is basically evaporating. And governments, they're suddenly facing these enormous, crippling costs just to refinance their own debt. So that 2.25% isn't just some abstract number, it's a heavy brake pedal being slammed down on a car that's already struggling to move.
Moving on to Section 3, the new China shock.
Just as Europe's domestic economy is limping along under this stagflation, an external threat arrives at literally the worst possible time. The whole dynamic of global trade is fundamentally shifted here. As you can see, China is no longer just buying European industrial products. Massive Chinese manufacturing capacity is actively competing against them. See, China has built up enormous domestic production capabilities, but their own domestic demand just isn't enough to absorb it all. So what happens? Chinese companies are looking overseas. They're pivoting massive, almost unimaginable surpluses of electric vehicles, machinery, chemicals, and steel straight into Europe, going head-to-head with domestic manufacturers.
And this brilliantly illustrates the sheer scale of that shift. Even Germany, which is historically Europe's absolute undisputed industrial powerhouse, saw its imports from China shoot up by a staggering 9.1% in just 1 month, in June 2026. This surge really narrowed Germany's trade surplus, and when the economic model of your strongest player is under this much pressure from weak foreign demand and intense Chinese competition, the entire European bloc is going to feel those shockwaves.
Next up is Section 4, the protectionism dilemma.
This flood of cheaper foreign goods forces policymakers in Brussels into an incredibly excruciating catch-22. It's a classic dilemma. On one hand, you impose tariffs. This protects your domestic factories and those high-paying industrial jobs, right? But it risks devastating Chinese retaliation against European exports, which would absolutely crush export-heavy countries like Germany. On the flip side, you just allow the competition. This provides cheaper goods to help reduce prices for consumers, which everyone wants, but it risks total deindustrialization. They want cheaper goods for sure, but they also desperately want strategic independence in factories. You just can't have it both ways.
Adding a whole other layer to this dilemma, the source material offers a pretty sharp political critique. Let's look at this quote. The EU is primarily focused on financing its proxy war against Russia via Ukraine instead of rebuilding and helping its economy grow. The analysis is forcefully arguing here that European leaders are prioritizing an expensive military-industrial complex and foreign conflicts over the urgent domestic economic survival reforms they actually need to weather the storm.
Finally, we arrive at Section 5, a crisis of competitiveness.
When you stack up the energy shock, the inflation trap, and this massive flood of foreign competition, you're not just looking at a temporary slump anymore. You're looking at a structural failure. Sure, tariffs might protect an industry for a little while, they buy you some time, but they absolutely cannot substitute for the core economic fundamentals that Europe is currently lacking. To actually survive this, Europe requires a few big things: cheaper energy, real technological innovation, faster productivity growth, competitive industry, and just massive investment. The real tragedy here is that Europe needs all of these things at the exact moment when high interest rates make them incredibly hard to achieve. The source makes it clear. The core problem isn't just China or inflation. It's that Europe's own policies have left it vulnerable.
So what'll leave you with this final, really provocative thought from the analysis to chew on? Can Europe remain an industrial powerhouse while paying sky-high energy costs and maintaining an incredibly expensive social model? If these underlying structural reforms just keep getting kicked down the road, is the decline of Europe as an industrial giant basically inevitable? It's a massive question, and honestly, how Europe answers it over the next few years is going to reshape the entire global economy. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep learning, keep questioning, and I will see you in the next one.